How long can a great nation watch the world burn before the flames finally reach its own shores? That question hovered over America in the late 1930s, even if most citizens didn't dare say it aloud. The United States had stepped back from Europe's troubles, convinced that the distance of two oceans was enough to guarantee safety. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension formed like the stillness before a storm no one wants to acknowledge. Across the country, daily life felt peaceful, almost insulated from the chaos erupting overseas. Families gathered around the radio, hearing news of battles across oceans, yet still feeling strangely disconnected. Many believed that America had paid its price in the First World War and had no reason to pay it again. The phrase, "never again," echoed in kitchens, factories, and small-town diners. But leaders in Washington heard a different echo, one of warning. Reports arriving from Europe painted a picture too familiar. The rise of dictators, the collapse of nations, the steady march toward another global catastrophe. America was determined to stay out, yet history seemed determined to drag it back in. The tension between those two forces was growing by the day. Neutrality became America's shield, a political promise repeated again and again. Congress passed laws to ensure the nation wouldn't be drawn into foreign wars, hoping legal boundaries could stop events unfolding thousands of miles away. Yet every newspaper headline hinted that the world was changing faster than legislation could contain. Still, most Americans clung to the belief that isolation was strength. After all, didn't the Atlantic and Pacific form natural barriers? Didn't geography itself protect the nation? It was comforting to imagine that oceans could do what armies could not. But global conflict was evolving, and oceans were shrinking metaphorically and soon literally. President Franklin D. Roosevelt felt that shift more sharply than most. He understood that neutrality wasn't the same as safety, and distance wasn't the same as immunity. But he also knew he couldn't move too boldly. The country was still traumatized by the memory of lost sons, shattered families, and disillusioned promises from the last war. America wasn't ready to hear warnings of another one. Behind closed doors, however, Roosevelt watched the world map with growing concern. Each invasion, each act of aggression, each collapse of a European democracy sent ripples across the Atlantic. He saw a pattern forming, one that suggested the United States might one day face a choice between action and survival. He hoped that choice could be delayed, but he doubted it could be avoided. Americans listened to radio addresses urging calm, stability, and continued neutrality. But even the most reassuring speeches couldn't hide the reality that the world was splitting into two very different paths. One path led to peace. The other led to a conflict that threatened to engulf continents. America was walking a delicate line right between them. Isolationist voices were loud and influential. Senators, journalists, and everyday citizens insisted that Europe's problems were not America's problems. To them, the lesson of World War I was simple. Involvement only brought grief. They argued that staying out was the key to national security, prosperity, and unity. At least, that's how it seemed, until events began to challenge that belief. Yet even in this period of determined distance, an undercurrent of unease flowed through the nation. People could sense that the world was becoming smaller, interconnected in ways that defied old assumptions. And somewhere in the quiet moments, between radio broadcasts, between letters from abroad, between headlines, Americans began to wonder if neutrality was a position they could truly maintain forever. Some officials inside the government whispered concerns that neutrality might only delay the inevitable. They studied reports, assessed foreign movements, and watched alliances harden across the globe. These quiet analyses suggested that the United States could not remain untouched forever, not when the world economy, international trade, and military ambitions were becoming increasingly intertwined. Even silence, they realized, was a form of participation. Across American ports, factories, and coastal cities, people began to feel an uneasy shift in the air. Ships arriving from across the Atlantic carried stories, first-hand accounts of nations collapsing. refugees fleeing, and armies advancing with terrifying speed. These stories didn't always make headlines, but they spread through conversations, leaving behind a sense that the world was spinning toward something no one could fully predict. In schools and colleges, young Americans debated what their role should be in a world moving toward war once again. Some argued passionately for staying out, determined not to repeat the mistakes of earlier generations. Others believed the U.S. could not stand idly by while democracies fell like dominoes. The debates were passionate, emotional, and often unresolved, mirroring the national mood itself. Meanwhile, the military quietly began preparing for possibilities it hoped would never come. Training intensified. Equipment was upgraded. Strategic plans long shelved were dusted off and revised. These preparations were subtle, often invisible to the general public, but they signaled a growing realization. Staying neutral required strength, and strength required readiness. As tensions rose abroad, American industries noticed something else: demand. European nations turned to the United States for supplies, equipment, and materials. Factories expanded. Jobs increased. For the first time since the Great Depression, the smokestacks of American industry climbed back into the sky. It was economic revival born from global instability, and many Americans watched it with a complicated mix of relief and apprehension. Radio hosts attempted to make sense of it all, speaking to an anxious public hungry for clarity. Their voices carried across living rooms, explaining battles overseas, but reminding listeners that America remained officially uninvolved. Yet there was a subtle shift in tone, an acknowledgement that the world's conflicts were beginning to brush against American interests in ways difficult to ignore. Still, there were those who believed the United States could thread the needle. They argued that the nation could prosper, strengthen itself, and still avoid direct involvement. For a brief moment, this idea seemed possible. The U.S. was distant, powerful, and cautious. But the world beyond its borders was not slowing down. Events were accelerating, pushing America closer to decisions it hoped to avoid. A sense of inevitability began to hang in the background, faint but persistent. Each new invasion, each diplomatic collapse, each broadcasted atrocity left Americans wondering whether neutrality was becoming more fragile. It was like watching a storm approach from afar, beautiful in its distance, terrifying in its direction. Yet life continued, almost defiantly. Families gathered for dinners, children played in the streets, and communities held on to normalcy with both hands. The idea that America was separate, safe, and shielded was comforting, even if cracks in that belief were beginning to show. People wanted to believe it was enough. They needed to believe it. But history has a way of closing in, no matter how far away it begins. And by the early 1940s, the question was no longer whether the world was changing. It was whether America could remain apart from that change. Somewhere between hope and fear, a realization was forming. Neutrality might not be a permanent shelter, but a temporary pause before a choice that no nation could avoid forever. If Europe falls, what happens to the world that follows? That was the haunting question echoing through diplomatic halls as the 1930s drew to a close. From across the Atlantic, Americans watched events unfold like a distant thunderstorm, loud, unsettling, and inching ever closer to the horizon. Few understood just how fast those clouds were gathering. In 1938, the world saw a warning sign that should have shaken everyone awake: the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany. It happened swiftly, almost effortlessly. For many in America, it was a moment that felt eerily familiar, a reminder of how quickly nations could disappear when confronted by ruthless ambition. Yet the reaction was mostly disbelief, astonishment, rather than alarm. Then came Munich. European leaders, desperate to avoid another catastrophic war, agreed to hand over the Sudetenland to Hitler in a deal meant to preserve peace. Americans listened to radio broadcasts describing it as a diplomatic victory, but observers with sharper instincts sensed something darker. Peace built on hope alone, they feared, was no peace at all. The illusion shattered when German troops marched into Czechoslovakia the following spring. No negotiations, no excuses, just occupation. For countries watching from afar, including the United States, the message was unmistakable. Hitler's ambitions were not regional but continental. A leader who broke promises so easily could not be contained by treaties. As Europe grew more unstable, Washington analysts began charting Germany's movements with growing urgency. Each action seemed part of a larger pattern. The military buildup, the propaganda campaigns, the territorial claims, they weren't isolated incidents. They were steps in a strategy built with cold precision. And the next step, many feared, would plunge the world into war. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans listened to the news with a mixture of confusion and concern. The names of places like Danzig, Prague, and Rhineland felt foreign, yet the emotions behind them were universal: fear, defiance, uncertainty. People sensed something was unfolding, something big, but struggled to grasp how it might affect their own lives thousands of miles away. Then, in September 1939, the storm finally broke. Germany invaded Poland with overwhelming force, unleashing a new kind of warfare, fast, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. The world called it Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Within days, Europe was engulfed, and the uneasy peace of the interwar years vanished overnight. The United Kingdom and France declared war, but their early responses felt slow and uncertain. As the conflict escalated, Americans found themselves watching Europe much more closely. Despite the distance, the war felt different this time, bigger, more unpredictable, and far more dangerous to global stability. In Washington, the Roosevelt administration monitored the crisis minute by minute. Advisors feared that if Germany dominated Europe, the balance of global power would tilt in ways that could eventually threaten the Western Hemisphere. But the U.S. remained officially neutral, bound by laws and public sentiment that firmly opposed involvement. Even so, neutrality didn't mean indifference. America was beginning to understand that this war was not simply another European dispute. The stakes were rising, the world was changing, and the storm sweeping across Europe was sending its first winds across the Atlantic, carrying a warning the United States could no longer ignore. As the war intensified, Europe's political landscape changed at a pace that left diplomats scrambling to keep up. One nation after another fell under German control, either through invasion or intimidation. Maps had to be redrawn almost monthly. For Americans watching from afar, it felt like witnessing the slow-motion collapse of an entire continent, one that once seemed unshakable. When France, one of the world's great powers, fell in June 1940, the shock rippled across the United States. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a symbol of how unstoppable Germany seemed. Newspapers printed photos of German troops marching through Paris, a sight that stunned Americans who had once believed such a thing was impossible. The storm was no longer distant, it was roaring. Britain suddenly stood alone. Night after night, the German Luftwaffe bombed London, Liverpool, Coventry, and other cities during the relentless Blitz. Yet Britain refused to break. Americans tuned into the radio, hearing correspondents describe explosions over London in real time. Those crackling broadcasts carried something unexpected: admiration. A sense that democracy itself was under fire. Winston Churchill's speeches reached American ears with remarkable impact. His defiant declaration, "We shall never surrender," became a rallying cry far beyond Britain's shores. Many Americans felt a stirring empathy for a nation fighting with everything it had. But empathy was not the same as intervention. The public remained cautious, torn between sympathy and the desire to stay out. The Roosevelt administration found itself walking a narrowing tightrope. They needed to support Britain without openly entering the war. So shipments of food, ammunition, and critical supplies flowed across the Atlantic under new legislation designed to keep America technically neutral. But everyone knew this was neutrality in form, not in spirit. Meanwhile, German submarines prowled the Atlantic, targeting ships carrying goods vital to Britain's survival. American vessels were not immune to danger. Every new attack raised the stakes, inching the U.S. closer to a confrontation it was still trying to avoid. The war was beginning to touch American interests directly, and that reality became harder to ignore. In living rooms across the country, people argued over what should come next. Some believed America had a moral obligation to help defend democracy against tyranny. Others insisted the country must protect its own sons from another European slaughter. The divide ran deep, shaping conversations in homes, newspapers, and the halls of Congress. Even Hollywood captured the tension. Movies reflected both the fear and fascination Americans felt toward the unfolding crisis. Newsreels before films showed dramatic footage of air raids and burning cities in Europe. Audiences sat in silence, watching real war projected on the screen, unable to look away, unable to forget. By late 1940 and into 1941, it became clear that the storm in Europe was evolving into something far larger than a regional conflict. It was changing alliances, economies, and the very idea of global order. The United States, still officially neutral, found itself pulled closer to the edge with every passing month. America hadn't entered the war, but the war was steadily coming to America's doorstep. And as events unfolded abroad, the question dominating Washington grew sharper. How long could the United States remain a spectator before the storm demanded a response? The answer was drawing nearer, carried across the ocean with every troubling headline. If a nation believes it cannot survive without expansion, what stops it from taking what it wants by force? That question defined Japan's strategy in the 1930s, long before the first American battleship was ever targeted. While Europe spiraled into conflict, another storm was brewing across the Pacific, one driven by ambition, resources, and a belief that Japan's destiny lay far beyond its shores. Japan had transformed rapidly in the early 20th century. Once isolated, it now boasted one of the most modern militaries in the world. Factories hummed, warships were launched, and its army expanded with confidence. To many Japanese leaders, these advancements weren't just national pride. They were proof that Japan deserved to shape Asia's future. The problem was simple. The empire wanted more than it had. Resource scarcity pushed Japan toward a dangerous conclusion. The nation lacked the oil, steel, and rubber needed to sustain its industry and its rising military power. Leaders viewed expansion not as a choice, but as a necessity. And so, eyes turned to the rich territories of Southeast Asia and China, lands filled with the very resources Japan believed essential for survival. By 1937, the invasion of China marked the beginning of a brutal conflict that shocked the world. American newspapers covered the violence with growing alarm, but at home, the U.S. remained officially neutral. Still, Washington watched closely as Japanese forces swept through cities and ports with devastating speed. It was clear Japan wasn't just testing its strength. It was rewriting the balance of power in Asia. Inside Tokyo, factions within the government pushed for even more aggressive expansion. Military leaders believed Japan had a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reshape the Pacific before Western nations could react. Diplomats urged caution, fearful of provoking the United States, but their voices were slowly drowned out by generals determined to seize their empire by force. Across the Pacific, Americans viewed Japan's actions with growing unease. Many considered Asia distant and unfamiliar, but they understood what unchecked aggression could lead to. The destruction in China echoed the early events of Europe, stirring a sense that the world's conflicts were beginning to mirror each other. Two storms, one in the west, one in the east, were now building at the same time. Japan's leaders studied the United States just as closely. They saw America's vast industrial capacity, its powerful navy, and its influence across the Pacific. To them, the U.S. was both a potential partner and the greatest obstacle to their ambitions. Every diplomatic cable exchanged between Tokyo and Washington carried this tension, respect mixed with suspicion. American businesses had long traded with Japan, especially in oil and metal. But as Japanese forces pushed deeper into China, public support for maintaining that relationship began to crumble. Protests, editorials, and political speeches increasingly painted Japan as a growing threat to peace in the Pacific. The calls for action, economic, not military, were getting louder. Yet Japan believed time was on its side. Each new offensive in Asia expanded its reach. Each conquered port strengthened its supply lines. The empire envisioned itself as the dominant power from Manchuria to the South Pacific. That confidence, however, came with a dangerous miscalculation, the assumption that the United States would never risk confrontation. But as territories fell and violence escalated, one question began to emerge on both sides of the Pacific. Was a clash between Japan and the United States becoming inevitable? The answer was slowly forming, hidden in policy meetings, military plans, and decisions that neither nation fully understood in the moment. The path ahead was narrowing, and both sides were moving toward a collision neither could avoid. As Japan pushed deeper into China, the cost of its campaign grew heavier. Resources drained faster than expected, and the war that Tokyo believed would be swift turned into a grinding conflict. This pressure only strengthened the voices of military hardliners who argued that Japan needed even more territory, more oil, more iron, more land to secure its future. Their solution was simple and dangerous: expand further, faster, and regardless of who stood in the way. Washington responded with increasing alarm. American diplomats warned Japan that further aggression would carry consequences, but Tokyo viewed these warnings as obstacles rather than deterrents. As Japanese forces moved southward, the United States tightened export controls, restricting shipments of aviation fuel, machine parts, and eventually even scrap metal. These economic measures struck at the heart of Japan's war machine. Inside Japan, these actions were interpreted not just as pressure, but as provocation. Newspapers fired up resentment, painting the United States as a nation trying to strangle Japan's rightful rise to power. For many military leaders, the sanctions confirmed what they had long believed. America would eventually stand in the way of Japan's ambitions, and confrontation was becoming harder to avoid. Meanwhile, negotiations between the two nations became increasingly tense. Diplomats discussed peace terms, territorial limits, and economic cooperation, but every meeting seemed to end further apart than it began. Japan wanted freedom to expand across Asia. The United States wanted the violence in China to stop. Neither side was willing to yield. The room for compromise shrank with each passing month. In America, the public watched Japan's actions with a mix of anger and anxiety. Newspapers published photographs of ruined cities in China, stirring sympathy and outrage. Radio commentators warned that Japan's expansion could eventually threaten American territories in the Pacific. The idea that the United States might one day face conflict in Asia no longer seemed unthinkable. It seemed plausible. Japan faced a troubling calculation. Without American oil, its Navy and Air Force would be crippled within months. With American interference, its imperial goals would be stalled indefinitely. The choice, as military planners saw it, was stark: submit to economic pressure or strike quickly before the United States could react. The more Tokyo debated, the more that second option gained momentum. As 1941 progressed, Japan began quietly preparing for potential conflict, even while diplomats continued to negotiate. Ships were relocated, pilots trained relentlessly. Military planners studied maps of the Pacific with cold precision. They believed that if Japan could strike first fast and decisively, it might buy enough time to complete its expansion before the United States recovered. In Washington, intelligence officials sensed Japan's frustration, but could not determine where or when a strike might occur. The Pacific was vast, and possibilities seemed endless. The uncertainty was unnerving. American forces prepared as best they could, strengthening bases, reviewing strategies, and watching the Pacific with increasing vigilance. But they could not predict the scale of what was coming. By late 1941, the tension had reached a breaking point. Both nations continued speaking of peace while quietly bracing for war. Japan was running out of patience. The United States was running out of trust. And between the two, a sense of inevitability settled in a silent recognition that the path they had walked for years was now leading them toward a collision neither side could fully stop. The Pacific, once a vast ocean separating nations, had become a narrow corridor of suspicion, strategy, and ambition. And somewhere within that tightening space, Japan made a decision that would change the course of history. If war could not be avoided, then it would be Japan who struck first. That choice would set the stage for one of the most shocking moments in American history. A leader does not choose the moment history calls, but he must choose how to answer it. For President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the late 1930s felt like walking across a thin rope suspended between two worlds, one pleading for peace, the other racing toward war. Every decision he made balanced public opinion, global danger, and the fragile hope that America could stay safe without staying blind. Roosevelt understood something many Americans did not want to hear. The world was becoming too interconnected for isolation to guarantee security. Europe was falling into turmoil. Asia was erupting into conflict. Yet at home, the wounds of World War I were still raw. Families remembered the cost sons who never returned, promises that peace would be lasting, and a sense of betrayal from wars to end all wars. Roosevelt had to tread carefully or risk losing the trust of a nation still healing. In public, he spoke calmly, reassuring citizens that America sought peace above all. His fireside chats were warm and steady, designed to ease fears, not spark them. But behind the calm voice was a man watching the world with growing urgency. He saw threats forming on two sides of the globe, threats that could eventually reach America whether the public believed it or not. Inside the White House, Roosevelt held quiet meetings with advisors, military officers, and foreign diplomats. They pored over maps and reports, tracking Germany's aggression in Europe and Japan's expansion in Asia. The president listened carefully, weighing every word. His goal was not to drag America into a war. It was to avoid being caught unprepared if war reached them anyway. To strengthen the nation without alarming it, Roosevelt began subtly expanding American defenses. Naval budgets increased, military training intensified. Factories were encouraged to modernize and prepare for higher production. These steps were gradual, often hidden behind civilian initiatives, but they reflected a growing belief that America needed to be ready for any possibility. Still, public opinion remained firmly against involvement. Isolationist voices were strong, powerful senators, influential businessmen, and organizations like the America First Committee argued passionately that the U.S. must stay out of foreign conflicts. Roosevelt heard them loudly, and he knew ignoring them could fracture the nation at a critical moment. Every move he made had to be measured, deliberate, and politically survivable. So Roosevelt crafted a strategy built on subtlety. He avoided dramatic declarations and instead spoke about defending American interests, protecting democracy, and supporting nations resisting tyranny without promising direct intervention. These speeches softened the edges of the debate, gently guiding public opinion without appearing to force it. It was persuasion by patience. Meanwhile, events overseas grew increasingly dire. Reports from Europe described entire nations collapsing before the German advance. Radio broadcasts from London narrated bombings in real time. Roosevelt listened to these accounts in silence, aware that every new development strengthened his belief that isolation was no longer sustainable. But belief alone wasn't enough. He needed the American people to see it too. Roosevelt began framing the conflict as something larger than territorial disputes. He described it as a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, between freedom and domination. This wasn't propaganda, it was the worldview he genuinely held. But it also served a political purpose. It helped Americans understand that the stakes of the global conflict reached beyond foreign borders. Throughout it all, Roosevelt maintained a delicate balance, reassuring the public while quietly preparing the nation for a world growing more dangerous by the day. He walked the tightrope with caution, skill, and a deep sense of responsibility. Because he knew that one misstep, one premature action or careless word, could push America into chaos long before it was ready. As Roosevelt navigated this political and moral balancing act, he increasingly relied on information from intelligence agencies, diplomats, and foreign allies. These reports painted a world sliding toward catastrophe. They showed German U-boats prowling the Atlantic, Japanese armies advancing through Asia, and the fragile resistance of nations trying to hold the line. Roosevelt knew the United States couldn't simply ignore these warning signs. But knowing was one thing, convincing the nation was another. He began strengthening relationships with world leaders who shared his concerns, especially British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Their correspondence became legendary letters filled with urgency, strategy, and a shared belief that democracy was facing its greatest test. Roosevelt offered sympathy and cautious support, careful not to reveal too much to a public still divided on foreign involvement. But privately, he admired Britain's resolve and understood its survival was crucial to America's own security. At home, Roosevelt pushed for programs that blurred the line between neutrality and assistance. The most significant was the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which allowed the United States to send weapons, supplies, and equipment to nations fighting the Axis powers. Roosevelt described it simply: if your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend them a hose. It was a metaphor that resonated with Americans, helping them see aid not as joining a war, but preventing a larger disaster. Yet even with such careful messaging, opposition remained fierce. Isolationists accused Roosevelt of inching the country closer to war. Political opponents warned that helping foreign nations risked repeating the tragedy of World War I. Rallies were held, speeches given, and newspapers argued both sides with passion. Roosevelt didn't try to silence these debates. He understood that democracies argue loudly before acting. Meanwhile, the American military quietly accelerated its preparations. New aircraft rolled out of factories. Warships patrolled the Atlantic more boldly. Industrial mobilization, the ability to convert civilian manufacturing into wartime production, became a growing priority. Roosevelt's goal wasn't to rush into battle, but to ensure that if America were ever forced into it, the country wouldn't enter as the underdog. Across the nation, subtle shifts began to appear. Public opinion polls showed Americans growing more sympathetic toward Britain. The brutality of Axis expansion became harder to ignore. And Roosevelt's measured tone, combined with global events, gradually nudged Americans to accept that neutrality might have limits in a world consumed by aggression. Still, Roosevelt avoided any statement that could spark panic. He spoke instead of preparedness, unity, and defending American values. His words carried reassurance, even when the meaning beneath them hinted at rising danger. He knew the country needed confidence, not fear. And so he gave them calm, even while his administration braced for worst-case scenarios. As 1941 progressed, the president faced increasing pressure from all sides: world leaders seeking help, political rivals demanding restraint, military commanders requesting resources, and citizens trying to understand their role in an unpredictable world. Every decision felt like a step on a rope stretched tighter by the day. But Roosevelt kept walking. Not hastily, not recklessly, just steadily. He believed leadership and preparing for the future others couldn't yet see. And the future he saw was one where America might not have the luxury of choosing when to enter the global conflict. He wanted the nation ready, mentally and materially, long before that moment arrived. By late 1941, the tightrope had grown dangerously thin. War raged across two continents. Diplomacy was failing in the Pacific. German forces dominated Europe. And the United States, though still officially neutral, was drifting closer to the storm with every new crisis. Roosevelt didn't know when the breaking point would come, but he sensed it was near. And he understood that once it arrived, there would be no going back. How do you stay out of a war while supplying the very nations fighting it? That paradox defined America's role in the early years of World War II. The United States was officially neutral, but neutrality was becoming harder to maintain as the world unraveled. Roosevelt understood that helping certain nations survive was essential, not just for them, but for America's own future. And so began a new chapter, supporting the war effort without firing a single shot. In the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, the hum of machinery grew louder. Assembly lines that once produced cars and household goods were retooled to build engines, rifles, and critical components. Workers didn't wear military uniforms, yet their labor became a quiet front line. America was becoming what Roosevelt would famously call the arsenal of democracy. The change didn't happen overnight. It started with the Neutrality Act's laws designed to keep the United States out of foreign conflicts. But as Axis aggression intensified, Roosevelt pushed the boundaries of those laws, finding creative ways to support countries fighting for their survival. One of the earliest steps was the cash and carry policy, allowing nations like Britain and France to purchase American supplies as long as they transported them on their own ships. For many Americans, this felt like a safe compromise. They could help democracies without risking American lives. But for Roosevelt, it was only the first step. He knew Britain's survival was critical. If Britain fell, the Axis powers would control the Atlantic, and America's own security would be threatened. Helping Britain wasn't charity, it was strategy. As the war dragged on, Britain's resources and finances dwindled. They could no longer afford to cash and carry. So Roosevelt proposed a bold solution, the Lend-Lease Act. The idea was simple but revolutionary. America would lend or lease weapons, vehicles, and equipment to nations whose defense was deemed vital to the United States. Payment could come later or not at all. When Roosevelt explained Lend-Lease to the public, he used an analogy that resonated deeply. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell them a hose. You lend it to them. It wasn't about joining the fire, it was about preventing it from spreading. His words helped many Americans accept a policy that effectively placed the country on the side of the Allies, even without declaring war. Opponents argued fiercely against Lend-Lease. Isolationists warned that lending weapons was no different from entering the conflict. Newspapers accused Roosevelt of provoking Germany. Some claimed the program would bankrupt the nation. But supporters countered that failing to help Britain would be far more dangerous and far more costly in the long term. Despite the controversy, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. Within months, American ships, tanks, airplanes, and ammunition began crossing the Atlantic in massive quantities. Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other nations fighting the Axis received vital support that kept their armies alive. These shipments became lifelines floating proof of America's growing involvement in the global struggle. Back home, the American economy surged. Factories ran day and night, creating jobs and pulling the nation out of the Great Depression more effectively than any previous policy. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. Rural communities experienced growth. Entire cities transformed into industrial hubs. War production, though not yet America's war, was reshaping the nation. And through it all, Roosevelt maintained one message. The United States was helping, not fighting. It was aiding freedom, not joining battle. But even as he reassured the public, events overseas suggested that this line, carefully drawn, heavily defended, was beginning to blur. America was not in the war, but the war was rapidly drawing closer. As Lend-Lease shipments increased, the Atlantic Ocean became a highway of hope and danger. German U-boats lurked beneath the waves, hunting Allied convoys with ruthless efficiency. American ships weren't supposed to be part of the fighting, yet the line between escorting and engaging grew thinner each month. Naval patrols stretched farther from U.S. shores, watching for threats that seemed to multiply by the day. Neutrality in practice was becoming a fragile illusion. American sailors felt that change firsthand. They reported sightings of periscopes, torpedo trails, and suspicious vessels in the North Atlantic. In several incidents, American ships exchanged fire with German submarines, officially in self-defense, but practically as part of the wider struggle. Each skirmish made headlines back home, sparking debates about how long America could avoid deeper involvement. The ocean no longer separated the United States from the war. It connected them. Meanwhile, the scale of American aid transformed the conflicts overseas. Soviet troops used American trucks to move across frozen terrain. Chinese forces received food, weapons, and equipment. British pilots flew American-built aircraft in defense of their battered cities. American factories were fueling resistance across multiple continents. It was support on a scale the world had never seen support that carried consequences. Roosevelt framed this massive mobilization as a moral duty, emphasizing that America was defending the principles of freedom and stability. But beneath this idealism was a strategic truth. The stronger the Allies remained, the longer war stayed away from American shores. Supporting them was an investment in national security as much as global peace. Workers in American factories understood this instinctively. Many taped photographs of British or Soviet soldiers to their workstations. Some wrote messages on crates headed overseas. Others volunteered for longer shifts, believing their labor mattered. They weren't wearing helmets or carrying rifles, but they felt part of something larger, an effort that blurred the line between civilian production and military action. Even so, tensions at home persisted. Isolationist leaders demanded that America withdraw from foreign entanglements immediately. They warned that each ship sent, each bullet produced, each convoy escorted pushed the nation closer to war. Congressional hearings grew heated. Public rallies grew louder. The nation was divided not by indifference, but by fear of repeating the heartbreak of the last World War. Yet as the months passed, more Americans began to sense a troubling truth. Staying out of the fighting did not mean staying untouched. The Axis powers were expanding unchecked. Democracies were struggling to hold the line. And America's own economic and strategic interests were increasingly intertwined with those of the Allies. Neutrality felt less like safety and more like waiting for a storm that refused to change course. Radio broadcasts added urgency to the debate. Reports from London described nightly air raids. Stories from China detailed the brutality of Japan's advance. And in Europe, rumors circulated about atrocities committed under Nazi occupation. These accounts weren't just news, they were emotional sparks that pushed public opinion closer to supporting stronger action. The world was burning, and America could feel the heat. Roosevelt sensed the shift. In speeches, he began speaking more openly about the global stakes. He talked about the need to defend the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. These weren't just ideals. They were foundations of a world he believed was worth defending, even if the nation wasn't ready to declare war. By late 1941, America had become the beating heart of Allied supply. It was a nation preparing for a battle it claimed it didn't want, supporting allies it said it wasn't fighting alongside, and patrolling waters where neutrality no longer meant safety. The United States was helping without fighting, but the gap between the two was narrowing. And soon, events would close it entirely. A nation squeezed long enough will eventually strike back, whether wisely or recklessly. That was the quiet fear running through Washington as Japan's war in China dragged on. What Tokyo expected to be a swift victory had turned into a grinding conflict that drained resources, money, and morale. As the campaign expanded, Japan's need for vital materials, especially oil, grew more desperate with each passing month. The United States watched these developments closely. For years, America had supplied Japan with the very resources fueling its war machine. But as reports of atrocities in China reached American newspapers, the public's patience evaporated. Pressure mounted on Roosevelt to take a stand not with troops, but with economic leverage that could slow Japan's advance without igniting open conflict. In 1940, the U.S. took its first major step, restricting the export of aviation fuel and certain metals to Japan. These weren't full sanctions, but they were clear warnings. To Japanese leaders, however, they felt like the first tightening of a noose. The restrictions hinted at a troubling possibility that America might use economic power to halt Japan's entire expansion across Asia. Japan's response was a mix of anger and calculation. Some officials argued for diplomacy, believing compromise could ease tensions. But military hardliners viewed the restrictions as hostile acts designed to contain Japan's rightful ambitions. They insisted the empire must push forward, seizing more territory, securing more resources, and eliminating American influence in the Pacific before it grew too strong. As Japan expanded further into Southeast Asia, Washington tightened its policies again. More materials were restricted. Diplomatic warnings grew sharper. Roosevelt hoped these measures would deter Japan, forcing it to rethink aggression without triggering war. But in Tokyo, every new restriction fed a growing sense of humiliation and urgency. Japan felt cornered. The breaking point came when Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy in late 1940. This alliance signaled that Japan was prepared to stand with the Axis powers and challenge Western influence head-on. To American officials, it was a chilling confirmation of Japan's intentions. To Japan, it was insurance, a message that it wouldn't bow to American pressure. Still, the US hesitated to escalate. Roosevelt believed economic pressure could guide Japan toward negotiation, not conflict. Yet the more the United States squeezed, the more determined Japan became to secure the resources it needed by force. Both nations insisted they wanted peace, yet their actions pushed them closer to confrontation. By early 1941, the Pacific was thick with tension. Ships shadowed each other, diplomats exchanged sharp messages, and both sides watched the other with rising suspicion. A dangerous paradox had taken hold. Each nation believed it was acting defensively, yet each step made war more likely. Japan's resource crisis reached its peak when the United States froze Japanese assets in July 1941. Overnight, Japan lost access to most of its oil supply, a lifeline for its Navy, Air Force, and industry. Without American oil, Japan's military strength would collapse within months. Tokyo faced a stark reality. Negotiate or seize the resources it needed before time ran out. Inside Japan's leadership, debates turned heated. Civilian officials urged diplomacy, believing the compromise with Washington could restore trade and avoid disaster. But military leaders saw the situation differently. To them, the embargo confirmed what they had predicted for years, that America intended to block Japan's rise. The only solution, they argued, was action. Bold, decisive, and immediate. Negotiations stumbled forward, but progress was painfully slow. Japan offered partial concessions in China, but refused to abandon its core ambitions. The United States demanded full withdrawal. Neither side was willing to yield, and every failed meeting deepened frustration. Diplomacy continued, but the window for peace was closing fast. Meanwhile, Japan's military began exploring options none of the diplomats knew about. If Japan could secure the oil-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya, it could survive without American imports. But there was a problem. The U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor stood directly in the way. Japan concluded that any major expansion in Southeast Asia would provoke America. Therefore, they reasoned, the only way to succeed was to strike first. American intelligence noticed troubling signs, troop movements, coded communications, unusual naval activity, but the Pacific was vast and predictions were uncertain. Washington prepared for conflict somewhere, somehow, but the exact target remained unclear. Few imagined the blow would fall on Hawaii. Most attention focused on the Philippines or Southeast Asia. In the U.S., public opinion continued shifting. The Japanese embargo was widely supported. Americans believed it might stop the war in Asia without risking American lives. Few realized how dramatically it had cornered Japan's leaders. Economic pressure was meant to prevent conflict, but instead, it pushed Japan toward a devastating decision. By the fall of 1941, Japan faced what it believed was an impossible choice: accept American demands and withdraw from its conquests, or gamble everything on a surprise military strike that could secure the empire's future. Pride, fear, and desperation merged into a single dangerous conviction. If war was coming, Japan must control the first move. The stage was set. Diplomacy continued in name only. Both nations publicly spoke of peace, yet their actions revealed a different truth. The pressure that America applied and the way Japan reacted had created a fuse that was now burning quickly. And at the end of that fuse lay Pearl Harbor. The year 1941 opened with a faint hope that diplomacy might still rescue the Pacific from disaster. Japanese and American envoys exchanged polite smiles, formal bows, and carefully worded communiques. Yet behind every handshake was the undeniable tension of two nations moving in opposite directions. Peace was the stated goal, but neither side trusted the other enough to reach it. Japan arrived at the negotiating table carrying the weight of an empire stretched thin. Its armies were bogged down in China, supplies were dwindling. American sanctions had choked its fuel supply. Diplomats from Tokyo insisted Japan needed breathing room, a phrase that sounded harmless but masked ambitions for vast, territorial expansion across Asia. For Washington, that was a red flag. The United States approached negotiations with its own set of concerns. American officials believed that the stability of Asia and perhaps the world depended on stopping Japanese aggression. They demanded Japan withdraw from China and respect the sovereignty of its neighbors. But for Japan's military leaders, retreat was unthinkable. Withdrawal meant humiliation. It meant the collapse of everything they'd fought for. Meetings dragged on for hours, sometimes days. Translators worked tirelessly to prevent misunderstandings. Yet the core problem wasn't language, it was intent. Japan wanted recognition of its dominance in Asia. The United States wanted the restoration of peace and territorial integrity. Both believed their demands were reasonable. Both believed the other was stalling. Behind closed doors, tempers flared. American advisors warned Roosevelt that Japan was buying time to strengthen its military. Japanese officials suspected Washington was using diplomacy as a trap, delaying until Lend-Lease shipments turned China and the Allies stronger. The peace talks became less about solutions and more about suspicion. Even so, both nations clung to the idea of negotiation, not because they trusted each other, but because the alternative was far more dangerous. Japan feared a war it might not win. America feared a war it was not yet prepared to fight. So the diplomats kept talking, even as the space between their positions grew wider. In November 1941, Japan presented a proposal demanding America lift its embargoes and accept Japan's sphere of influence in Asia. Roosevelt studied the document in silence. Accepting it meant sacrificing China and betraying American principles. Rejecting it meant risking war. The president chose the only option he believed was morally acceptable. He refused. Japan responded with a final offer that appeared more flexible, but still protected its core ambitions. American officials debated it intensely. Some believed compromise could buy time. Others saw it as a strategic illusion. In the end, Washington drafted the famous Hull Note, demanding Japan withdraw completely from China and Indochina. For Japan's hardliners, this was unacceptable, an insult wrapped in diplomacy. As the Hull Note reached Tokyo, the Japanese cabinet erupted in arguments. Moderates urged patience, insisting the United States might still soften its stance. But the military faction had already reached its conclusion. America was never going to recognize Japan's empire. Negotiation, they said, had become a dead end. The time for bold action had arrived. Yet astonishingly, even as war plans were finalized, diplomats continued to meet. Tokyo instructed them to keep negotiating until the very last moment, an effort to maintain the appearance of peace while the Navy prepared for war. The envoys themselves did not know the full extent of what was being planned. They spoke of compromise while their own government prepared for conflict. In Washington, Roosevelt sensed something was wrong. Intelligence hinted at Japanese troop movements, unusual radio silence, and shifting naval formations. But the clues were scattered, incomplete, and often contradictory. The Pacific was vast. The possibilities were endless. Roosevelt knew danger was coming, he just didn't know from where. Meanwhile, the American public followed the negotiations with cautious optimism. Newspapers reported every meeting, every hint of progress. Americans desperately hoped diplomacy would prevail. They didn't want war with Germany, let alone Japan. Few realized how close their country had already drifted toward the edge. As the talks neared their final days, Japanese diplomats requested one more meeting, one last attempt, at least an appearance to avoid conflict. But by then, Japan's fleet was already at sea, moving silently across the Pacific toward Hawaii. The decision had been made, the die had been cast. Diplomats were now shadows of a plan far beyond their control. On December 6th, Roosevelt read a personal message from the Japanese emperor, hinting at peace but offering no real concessions. It was eloquent, emotional, and ultimately meaningless. Roosevelt sensed the contradiction. The letter spoke of harmony, yet the intelligence signals whispered of imminent danger. Something wasn't adding up. By the time the Japanese envoys arrived in Washington on December 7th to deliver their government's final message, fate had already overtaken diplomacy. While they prepared to read the formal breakdown of negotiations, Japanese aircraft were already in the skies over Pearl Harbor. Diplomacy hadn't failed, it had simply been outrun. In the end, Segment 7 stands as one of history's most painful ironies. Two nations speaking of peace while marching toward war. Words continued until the very last second, but words could no longer stop what was coming next. The most dangerous moment in a war is often the one before the first shot is fired. For Japan's military leadership, late 1941 became a countdown and irreversible march toward a decision they believed could determine the empire's survival. The plan forming in Tokyo was bold, risky, and unprecedented. A single, devastating surprise attack designed to neutralize the United States before it could fight back. Japan's naval strategists believed they faced a closing window. American embargoes were strangling Japan's fuel supply. The Navy, Japan's pride, had only months of oil reserves left. If the United States continued applying pressure, Japan feared its military machine would grind to a halt. The only alternative, they believed, was a decisive first strike that would buy time to seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. The architect of the plan, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, understood both its brilliance and its danger. A seasoned strategist, he had studied in the United States and respected its industrial power. He famously warned, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." Yet even he believed Japan had no choice. The empire was cornered, desperate, and driven by a belief that a calculated gamble could reshape the entire Pacific. The target they chose was daring: Pearl Harbor, the home of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Japan believed that destroying America's battleships and crippling its naval power in a single morning could paralyze the United States long enough for Japan to seize the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies territories rich in the resources Japan needed to survive. The goal wasn't conquest of America. It was shock, paralysis, and time. Planning for the attack became a masterclass in secrecy. Japanese engineers modified torpedoes to operate in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. Pilots trained relentlessly for precise bombing runs. Submarines were positioned to track American ship movements. The fleet practiced radio silence, rehearsed formations, and studied the geography of Oahu in painstaking detail. Every detail mattered, because Japan believed a single failure could ruin the entire operation. Meanwhile, Tokyo's diplomats continued negotiating in Washington, unaware of exactly when the attack would come. The military kept them intentionally in the dark, believing plausible diplomacy would ensure America remained off guard. Messages sent between Tokyo and its embassy grew more urgent, more cryptic, and more time-sensitive. The diplomats were becoming props in a much larger strategy. American intelligence intercepted some of Japan's communications, but not enough to reveal the full plan. Analysts sensed danger. They tracked unusual Japanese naval activity. They warned that an attack was likely somewhere in the Pacific. But with Japan's fleet maintaining strict silence, the exact location remained a mystery. The Philippines, Thailand, or even the Dutch East Indies seemed far more logical targets than Hawaii. On November 26, 1941, Japan's attack fleet left its northern base in total secrecy. As battleships, carriers, and destroyers pushed across the icy Pacific, the sailors aboard knew what lay ahead. Many wrote final letters, some prayed. Others believed they were taking part in a moment that would define Japan's destiny. Every mile they sailed brought them closer to a point of no return. To avoid detection, the fleet traveled a remote northern route, far from commercial shipping lanes. The crews endured brutal cold, rough seas, and complete radio silence. Their only guidance came from lantern signals and coded flags. The Pacific was enormous, but the margin for error was razor thin. One sighting, one transmission could ruin everything. As the strike force approached Hawaii, commanders reviewed their attack plan one final time. Fighter planes would hit airfields first, grounding American aircraft. Dive bombers and torpedo planes would target battleships moored in neat, predictable rows. Bombers would strike the harbor's infrastructure. It was intended to be fast, coordinated, overwhelming over before the Americans could mount any real defense. Back in Washington, the final hours of peace unfolded with a strange calm. Diplomats scheduled another meeting. Roosevelt studied intelligence reports that suggested danger but offered no clarity. American commanders in Hawaii were aware Japan might strike somewhere, but Pearl Harbor still seemed unlikely. The idea of a massive long-range carrier attack remained almost unthinkable. Japan's leaders, meanwhile, crossed a psychological threshold. They convinced themselves that America, a nation seen as wealthy and comfortable, would lose the will to fight after a devastating blow. They misread America's character, equating reluctance with weakness. This miscalculation would become one of the most consequential errors in modern history. As dawn approached on December 7th, Japanese pilots climbed into their aircraft, engines trembling against the morning air. The sun rose over the Pacific as the attack fleet reached its position north of Oahu. Tora, 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 the coded phrase meaning complete surprise, was ready to be transmitted. History stood on the edge of a moment that would change everything. The objective was not occupation, not conquest, but shock so great it would freeze American decision-making. The Japanese command believed victory depended on that brief pause. A stunned United States unable to respond until Japan secured its new empire. It was a calculated gamble, one rooted in desperation, ambition, and profoundly flawed assumptions. In those final quiet minutes before the attack began, the Pacific was deceptively peaceful. Fishermen cast lines from Oahu's shores. Sailors slept aboard their ships. Families prepared for a Sunday morning that seemed like any other. No one knew that thousands of feet above the ocean, hundreds of aircraft were closing in. The strike was meant to stun America into inaction. Instead, it would awaken a force far greater than Japan had ever imagined. Segment 8 ends here, with engines roaring to life over the Pacific and fate descending toward Pearl Harbor. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. Those words, crackling through radio static at 7:55 a.m., marked the moment America's world changed forever. For years, the nation had watched the rising storms of war from a distance concerned, preparing, but still hoping diplomacy or geography would keep the conflict away. But on that quiet Sunday morning, hope was replaced by shock, fire, and history unfolding in real time. The attack began with eerie precision. Japanese aircraft broke through the clouds, sunlight glinting off their wings as they dove toward the harbor. Sailors eating breakfast or still sleeping in their bunks looked up in disbelief. Some thought it was a training exercise. Others assumed it was an American drill. But the sound of explosions shattered any illusion. Pearl Harbor was under attack. The first wave targeted airfields. In minutes, Japanese fighters swept across Oahu, strafing runways and destroying American aircraft before they could take off. Flames roared across rows of parked planes. Pilots sprinted through smoke and debris, desperately trying to reach aircraft that would never leave the ground. The attackers wanted the skies silent, and they succeeded. Then came the torpedo planes, skimming low over the water. Their targets were the battleships lined neatly along Battleship Row. The USS Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, and others became instant focal points. Torpedoes ripped into hulls. Massive steel ships groaned, buckled, and began to sink. The harbor erupted into columns of fire, oil, and shattered metal. The USS Arizona suffered the most devastating blow. A bomb pierced her forward magazine, igniting thousands of pounds of gunpowder in a single instant. The explosion tore the ship apart, sending a towering fireball into the air. More than 1,000 sailors were killed in seconds. The shockwave echoed across the harbor, an unforgettable, searing moment, burned into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Chaos engulfed the entire base. Sailors leapt into the oily water to escape flames. Others climbed onto listing decks, trying to fight fires with hoses that sputtered weakly against the inferno. Medics rushed to makeshift aid stations. Civilians on Oahu stared at the smoke rising into the sky, stunned and unsure whether further invasions were coming. It felt like the world had tipped into something unimaginable. And yet, amid the destruction, acts of heroism were everywhere. Sailors manned anti-aircraft guns even while their ships burned beneath them. Crews worked together to rescue the trapped and wounded. Commanders organized defenses with incredible speed despite the chaos. The attack had caught the U.S. off guard, but it had not broken its resolve. The second wave hit with equal ferocity. Dive bombers struck remaining ships, shipyards, and base facilities. The air filled with the screech of engines, the thud of explosions, and the crackle of burning fuel. Japanese pilots executed carefully choreographed maneuvers, each determined to inflict maximum damage before American defenses hardened. By late morning, the skies finally fell silent. The Japanese planes retreated over the horizon as quickly as they had come. In their wake, the harbor lay in ruins. Battleships rested on the shallow bottom. Black smoke coiled into the sky. Fires raged across Hickam Field. Bodies and debris floated on the shimmering water. The scale of destruction was overwhelming. The human toll was staggering. Nearly 2,400 Americans were killed and more than 1,000 wounded. Families across Oahu searched frantically for loved ones. Medical teams worked without rest. Churches opened their doors for the grieving. Pearl Harbor, once a symbol of naval pride, had become a scene of devastation and loss. Throughout the day, confusion turned to grim clarity. American commanders pieced together reports. Civilians gathered around radios, listening in stunned silence as broadcasters described the attack. The nation, still half asleep on a Sunday morning, awoke to a nightmare that demanded an immediate and unified response. News spread across the mainland with unprecedented speed. In living rooms, diners, and packed city streets, Americans listened as radio announcers repeated the same heartbreaking truth. The country had been attacked without warning. Shock gave way to anger. Anger hardened into resolve. Pearl Harbor was not just a military strike, it was a turning point in American identity. President Roosevelt received the news and immediately convened military and civilian leaders. He understood the magnitude instantly. For years, he had tried to prepare the nation for the possibility of war. Now that choice had been made for them. The time for caution was over. The time for action had arrived. As the sun set over Hawaii, the fires continued to burn. Sailors searched through wreckage for survivors. Families kept vigil. The island was eerily quiet, except for the crackle of flames and the distant rumble of emergency vehicles. December 7th would be remembered as a day of shock, sorrow, and sacrifice, but also as the moment America united with a clarity it had not felt in decades. The attack intended to cripple American resolve. Instead, it ignited it. In the ashes of Pearl Harbor, a powerful transformation began. A nation that had walked the line of neutrality was now marching toward a global conflict with unwavering determination. The next morning, the world would hear Roosevelt speak the words that would echo through history, a date which will live in infamy. Segment 9 ends here, at the crossroads between devastation and destiny. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. With those words, President Franklin D. Roosevelt captured the shock, sorrow, and fury of a nation that had been attacked without warning. His voice was steady, resolute, and unmistakably clear. The United States of America was no longer standing apart from the world's conflict. The time for neutrality had ended. The time for action had begun. When Roosevelt addressed Congress on December 8th, the chamber was packed. Senators, representatives, military leaders, and reporters all gathered in tense silence. They already knew what must come next. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered political divides. Isolationists, interventionists, and undecided voices all shared the same conclusion. America had to respond. The vote for war against Japan passed almost unanimously. Outside the Capitol, crowds filled the streets, listening to the broadcast on loudspeakers. Some stood with tears in their eyes. Others clenched fists with determination. Ordinary Americans who had hoped to avoid war now felt a deep sense of purpose. The attack had united the country with an intensity no speech alone could have created. A nation once divided was now galvanized. Within hours, enlistment offices were overwhelmed. Young men lined up around city blocks, eager to serve. Fathers volunteered despite their age. Mothers joined auxiliary units, determined to contribute in any way they could. Women stepped into factories, offices, and military support roles. It wasn't just a government mobilizing, it was an entire society rising together. The military moved immediately. Damaged ships at Pearl Harbor were raised, repaired, and put back into service with remarkable speed. Aircraft production surged. Training centers expanded overnight. What had been a peacetime military now transformed at a staggering pace into a fighting force capable of waging a global war. America's industrial power became its greatest weapon. But Japan was not America's only enemy for long. In the days following the Pearl Harbor attack, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Hitler believed America would be too distracted by the Pacific to fight effectively in Europe. He underestimated the scale, unity, and determination that Pearl Harbor had unleashed. Roosevelt responded swiftly, declaring war on all three Axis powers. The United States was officially engaged in a two-front global conflict. Factories across the nation thundered with renewed purpose. Cars became tanks. Typewriters became rifles. Shipyards that once built cargo vessels now launched aircraft carriers and destroyers in record time. It was a transformation unmatched in history, a mobilization so vast and efficient that American industry would soon outproduce every other nation on Earth combined. On the home front, civilians adapted to a new reality. Rationing began. Victory gardens appeared in backyards. Families saved scrap metal and rubber. School children collected tin cans. Everyone felt responsible for the war effort. Patriotism wasn't just a feeling, it was a daily practice, woven into the rhythm of American life. Propaganda campaigns encouraged unity, resilience, and sacrifice. Posters urged Americans to conserve resources, stay vigilant, and support troops overseas. Movies, radio shows, and newspapers all contributed to a national narrative of determination. The message was simple: America would not be defeated. Meanwhile, military leaders began crafting the grand strategy that would shape the rest of the war. In the Pacific, the goal was clear halt Japan's advance, protect key territories, and push steadily across the ocean toward the heart of the empire. In Europe, the plan required careful coordination with the Allies, defend Britain, weaken Germany's industrial power, and open the path to liberate occupied nations. Roosevelt established new military commands, forged alliances, and expanded cooperation with Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. The arsenal of democracy was no longer just supplying the war, it was now a full combatant, coordinating offensives that spanned continents. The scale of responsibility was immense, but the nation was ready for it. At the same time, Americans grappled with the emotional cost of war. Families sent loved ones overseas, not knowing when or if they would return. News of casualties reached small towns and big cities alike. Blue Star service banners hung in windows. For all its unity and patriotic pride, the war brought deep personal sacrifice to every corner of the country. Yet even in the hardest moments, the resolve that Pearl Harbor ignited continued to grow. Each victory overseas brought hope. Each setback strengthened determination. America understood that the path ahead would be long, painful, and costly, but the mission was clear: restore peace, defend freedom, and ensure that an attack like Pearl Harbor could never happen again. By 1942, the transformation was unmistakable. A nation that had once struggled over whether to join the war was now leading it. Soldiers fought across deserts, islands, seas, and skies. Factories roared day and night. Allies coordinated strategies across hemispheres. The United States had become not only a participant, but a driving force in the global struggle. December 7th had begun as a day of tragedy, but its aftermath reshaped American identity, policy, and purpose. What the Japanese hoped would be a crippling blow became a catalyst for unity and resolve. The attack meant to shock America into retreat, instead awakened a power capable of reshaping the world. And so Segment 10 ends at the moment the United States steps fully into World War II determined, united, and ready to change the course of history.